Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here this afternoon, and thank you to Mayor Stoney and Bowser for joining us today. I am excited to have this conversation with you all because, as we know, cities have a vital role to play in the implementation of the federal dollars coming from these historic bills that we've been talking about today. And not only that, cities like DC and Richmond in particular face unique challenges in equitable implementation of money and resources. So, safe to say, we have a lot to cover, so let's just get right to it. As we begin 2023, I would like you to think about what you view as the biggest economic challenges facing your city. Small question. And what are the biggest opportunities? Localities have received historic investments from the American Rescue Plan and will serve as key partners in implementing federal investments from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. So, can you speak to the unique challenges that cities currently face and how you think these pieces of legislation are best suited to meet them? And home court advantage goes to you, Mayor Bowser.
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me today. And we always appreciate this summit and that it's in Washington, D.C. So please continue to support our businesses. I think that the biggest economic challenge, I would say two things. And one that I am very focused on is how to bring our economy all the way back post-COVID. We're strong in many ways in that a lot of our tourism dollars have come back, our hotels and restaurants have rebounded. We're still looking for our business traveler, and we need our downtown vibrant and productive with workers. So I would say our big focus is on this post-COVID new way of work and what that means for a capital city that was built on L'Enfant's plan with wide avenues and huge, majestic federal buildings that are good for about one thing. And that is making us one of the most beautiful and unique cities in the world, but also it puts a lot of space in our downtown that our federal government uses. So we're focused on that. The second thing I would say is how do we close wealth gaps? We are a city, and I say frequently that we're a prosperous city, and that's true. And that has allowed us to make huge investments in our social services. But we want to close wealth gaps between our mostly Native African American residents and their white counterparts. And we're focused on a few programs to do that, especially home ownership. I've set the goal to raise our median household income for Black families by $25,000 in the next 5 years and attract more residents at the same time. So those are our big issues.
Great. Mayor Stoney?
First, Mayor Bowser, it's great to be back in your beautiful city once again. I feel like I'm here every week, so I'm doing my part in
Thank you, Mayor Stoney.
putting my dollars into the coffers of the district's general fund. But not too different than what's going on in Washington, just 100 miles south in Richmond, the capital of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I know what's on the minds of all of our residents right now, and there's three things post-COVID-19, post the pandemic. Number one, housing. There's a housing crisis in all of our cities across this country, but also in rural and suburban areas as well. Number two, public safety. Folks want to feel safe when they step out into their neighborhoods, when they're sending their kids to school. So it's a priority of ours. And number three, priority for me is our children and our families right now. And so I think that these signature pieces of legislation passed here at the federal level have helped us sort of target these three main issues right here. So when I talk about housing, it was the American Rescue Plan. We used $20 million of the American Rescue Plan to focus on housing. So we normally have affordable housing trust fund. I said, let's bypass that this time around. Let's make the $10 million available for $20 million available for developers to get more housing, to build more housing in the city of Richmond. So we were to put $10 million on the street last year. We're doing $10 million again this year. But I'm taking $2 million of that focused on home ownership. This is a compliment to all mayors when you steal ideas. So I saw what Mayor Bowser was doing here in Washington, and I said, Well, that is an ambitious goal to get new homeowners, low-income homeowners in the district. And so I said, what can we do in Richmond? So we created a goal of putting 2,000 new homeowners into homes, low-income homeowners, by 2026, using the American Rescue Plan Act. But also, we want to focus on our children and families. And so we did feedback, a public engagement process throughout the city on how we were going to spend $155 million we were received from the federal government. We decided that we're going to use $78 million of it, roughly half, focused on children and families, focused on new community centers in black and brown neighborhoods that were redlined, and these places never had community centers. We're also going to focus on expanding child care as well. We created 250 new seats for early childhood education and preschool seats for our kids. And when it comes to simply infrastructure, Richmond's a historic city, but as you know, highways sort of damaged that community fabric in many of our cities. We saw the Harlem of the South in Jackson Ward, one of our historic black neighborhoods, that was basically bisected by I-95. And so what we are pitching to the federal government at the moment is trying to recreate those connections by building a bridge, a cap across I-95, so we can actually connect both parts of that neighborhood. One part of this neighborhood is public housing right now. The other part is you could say, an emerging gentrified neighborhood. How do we get that sort of success and growth on the other side of I-95? And so we believe these three pieces of legislation will be helpful to get us to our goals.
So I want to talk about the importance of getting dollars directly from the federal government. In Virginia, obviously you have a Republican governor, legislature is half controlled by Republicans. You want to say something, don't you?
I'm ready to answer the question.
Okay. And DC has its unique relationships, I would say, with the federal government. So can you talk about both the importance of being able to get money directly from the federal government to cities, but also any challenges that you might be facing because of these unique relationships?
Well, I will say when the CARES Act dollars first dropped during the height of the pandemic, I was hotter than fish grease because those dollars went directly to cities that had populations of 500,000 and above. And normally, we all don't want to have to deal with state government to get programs or dollars into programs that are going to save lives or lift people up. But lucky enough, I had a Democratic governor at the time. Then we had an election, things have totally changed. So when the American Rescue Plan Act came on the scene, we fought using our friendship, our relationships with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I'm the president of the Democratic Mayors Association. I said, how do we get dollars directly to cities, no matter the size? Right? And I'll have to say, we were able to get that in ARPA, and it gives us the flexibility to innovate and be creative, because at the end of the day, it's cities and mayors who are the front lines. We got our cities through the pandemic. We know about the inequities because they were illuminated during the pandemic, and I think we should be the ones that should be given the flexibility to create the programs that are going to lift our residents up and sort of tackle the issues, the problems. And so I'm grateful that we were able to get that function into the American Rescue Plan Act. And moving forward, it's my hope that they take a page out of President Biden's book and ensure that empower local governments to make these decisions. This is the largest investment in local government since the Great Society. And I think we're going to see great results and accomplishments for years and years to come.
I couldn't agree with the mayor more, and I think that the president deserves a lot of credit for making sure that the legislation, nobody wants to say they're bypassing governors, but that's the legislatures for sure, but the governors as well. And so getting the money directly to cities, I know was important for our conference. Now, we are different, as you know. We are city, county, state, all in one, and we lack any votes in the Congress. So that makes us different. Now, when it comes to getting state funding, it's good for us because we get the state funding. We were in a weird thing in the last administration, carved out of CARES. We fought for maybe a year and a half, and President Biden and Speaker Pelosi were very instrumental in making sure we got those CARES dollars. But it is key for cities to be able to implement in a way that's frequently doesn't get into the partisanship that sometimes you have on the state level. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's so key that mayors can say, look, this is, I know what the problem is. I spoke to my constituent about it in the grocery store, and I'm working with my agencies to implement it. In DC, and it's probably similar in Richmond, we can really go from an idea through a budget cycle to implementation in a year. You don't have that on the state level with the kind of the fighting among very disparate interests about how to spend money. And so that's why I think, and I don't know how big your council is, mine is 13. So between the 14 of us, we can really make some decisions about what works. Now, one thing I encouraged the administration to do was also think about procurement policies. Because when we're talking about all of this money, and it's great to have a lot of money, what's not great is not being able to spend it. And so as we think about policies that help us get dollars out the door, we should always think about innovative procurement policy as well.
And Daniella, can I add as well that because Mayor Bowser is absolutely correct, how can we expect someone who lives in the countryside of Virginia, in far reaches of Southwest Virginia, and or in the Valley, to know what are the issues that are on the minds of residents in the city of Richmond or any urban locale? And so giving us that creativity, that ability to make these decisions has gone a long way. And I wouldn't want to make decisions for those who live in rural parts of my state as well, if I'm the mayor of the city of Richmond.
So both of you have spoken about how new federal resources can help expand broadband in your cities, especially in underserved communities where internet access can be a major issue. Now, I think when people generally talk about expanding internet access, they think about rural areas, and obviously that is a misperception that it only affects those areas. So can you talk about why this investment is transformative in your cities and the effects it would have on people's lives?
I think for us, and it is a pillar in how we will deploy the infrastructure dollars, I impaneled a task force. We called it the Build Back Better Task Force. Former Secretary Rodney Slater was one of our co-chairs. We had several committees to help us think about what we wanted to go after in the competitive grants, how we would involve our businesses and our residents so that we were also using these dollars to promote our other goals. How are we building more Black homeowners and raising the wages for and the wealth of Native Washingtonians? So we were very focused on all of those issues. And I think what we have determined with broadband in this pandemic was a huge education for us in access. We think most people have high-speed internet where they live, but they may not always have the access points, whether it's the device or the service plan to connect to it. So we have challenged ourselves to look at our own networks that connect our schools and libraries to see if we can even help with free access around those buildings or maybe even into homes. So that's part of it. We have also initiatives around our public housing to make sure that we're getting more, if they don't already have high-speed internet, the access to tap into it, and the devices. So we have to continue to think about ways to make sure all of our communities are connected, because we're relatively small in geographic area, but we still have too many people who have trouble tapping in.
Very similar, in Richmond, a city of 230,000 people, roughly 45,000 do not have strong access to the internet. 5,000 don't have computers in their homes. So when 2020 came around, March of 2020, and all our children had to move into remote learning. And most of my students who go to our school district, 90% of them are black and brown. It became very difficult for them to actually be educated from all the computers that we were able to allocate dollars in the budget for them to take home, Chromebooks. But if you can't get on the internet from your unit in public housing, I think we're setting them up to fail. And so what I've done, using knowing that those dollars are out there, I've directed my Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Operations and Infrastructures to start to explore what are the barriers for some of our residents who are living in public housing, who are living in census tracts that are below the poverty line, and also our connectivity around the city as well, looking at public spaces as well. No child should have to go to a McDonald's or Chick-fil-A to get free access to the internet. And so how do we sort of light up the whole city in terms of connectivity to the internet, to Wi-Fi? And for us, unfortunately, this follows the same sort of, the footprint is the same footprint that you see in housing as well. If you were a red line neighborhood from a generation ago, you were likely to have a weak access to weak connectivity to the internet.
I want to talk about transportation, which is something that's been a through line for the conversations today. The IRA has, major new incentives to help people afford new and used electric vehicles, rooftop solar, new electric air conditioning and heating, and more. What's great about this is that many of these incentives are structured as upfront rebates, so they'll be available in many cases as homeowners and renters right away. But how can the federal government be a good partner to the city and ensure that these benefits are affordable and accessible for all families? Specifically, communities of color historically have not used these resources either due to a lack of access or other reasons. So how will you work to change that in the city with the new resources coming in?
Well, I think, I always say this, and I think it's true. Black and brown residents want exactly what white residents want too. Right? They want safe neighborhoods, they want access. And sometimes you just have to say it straight up. And so we would utilize these appliances, these goods, sometimes if we know where to go. And I think that's where the federal government can, I think, step up right here. Where do you go to get access to this? Right? We hear about it. Some people, if you read the newspaper, you may read about it. I can get this sort of discount on my washer machine or this sort of discount on my heating appliance. We know that it's in our neighborhoods where a lot of our residents are seeing rising rents, so housing costs are going up, and then the cost for energy as well. If you have a cost, you have some inefficiencies in your home, you're seeing those costs rise as well. So obviously this direct-to-customer strategy that the federal government is using, I think, is a positive. But if they don't know where to go to easily access it, that's a problem. That's a problem. So we have to sort of, I think that's the barrier that we have to fix. If the federal government can make it easier for them to find, it was a whole lot easier when you sent them a check and said, hey, it's in the mail, it's coming, right? We're not doing that with this. They have to actually go and to retrieve this. And so you have to sort of kind of in a more elementary way lay out how you get access to these sort of incentives.
I was really considering what you said carefully, because one of the things that we are very focused on in DC, and we heard the president talk about it last night, is what we're doing to protect and grow the middle class in America. And one frustrating thing I find about a lot of government programs is they tend to be focused, especially when it comes to financial support, only on the lowest income residents. And then they'll say, well, nobody's taking it. But the gulf between how to get for somebody with a very low income to an electric vehicle may be really wide, okay? And for some reason, we never focus on what we're doing for that middle income family. And I've got to say, I don't know about your city, but in our city, our middle income families are getting kicked. And when there are benefits and programs to be had, they're not for them. So I was knocking on doors one time recently, and a lady stopped me and she says, I'm an educator, I've done everything right, I'm a principal of an alternative school, I'm single, I don't have kids, I have my house, but what do you do for me? And I said, I hear you, I see you, I am you. And so part of what I talked about in my own inaugural remarks this past January is that as a city, when I look at the people who left DC during COVID, a lot of them were middle income folks, some of them young, most of them young, actually below 35, and they are shopping. Okay, they're shopping for places to live that support them. So a lot of our focus in DC is on growing and keeping the people in our middle class and making sure that we have ladders to the middle class for everyone. And these folks that I'm talking about are also likely adopters, aggressive adopters of all of the programs that you just mentioned. And so I think sometimes with these programs, they have to be designed, get the early, aggressive, low-hanging, all those terms you're used to, get them. And you know what, who else to get? The kids. Get the kids, because then the kids are going to talk to the parents. This was the playbook we used for recycling and other things to get families educated about the benefits. And I even heard one recently about, switching, and I don't want to talk about stoves, but it was about stoves.
Why? Everybody else is talking about stoves, might as well.
But I heard an argument that is getting promoted that I'd never really heard talked about a lot, and that was just the impact on asthmatic kids. It's like if you start talking about the impact on asthmatic kids, you have a whole nother group who's listening. So that's a long answer to say. I think a lot of these programs, the messaging around these programs, I know in our city would be a great benefit if we're talking about EV, if we're talking about solar, if we're talking about switching your appliances, that you're focused on that group. And it's like a package of great things that help you live in great places like DC.
So the IRA and the IIJA included formula and competitive grant funding opportunities for projects that improve walkability, safety, affordable transportation access. Now, the goal of this funding is to address the negative environmental and safety impacts from transportation infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. So how might these investments improve the planning and capacity building for projects in DC and in Richmond? And specifically in DC, will this funding help you reach your Vision Zero goal?
Yes, it will. And because we have looked at, I think, 120 intersections in DC, and I think all of us across the country recognize how shutting down your cities, taking cars off the road, I don't think we appreciated the recklessness that would follow when people did come back to the roads, and we're seeing it. We're seeing too many people driving. We need more people back on transit. And so we're dealing with all of that. And these dollars will help us advance planned work on making intersections more safe, for sure.
Yeah, we're doing the same work in the city of Richmond as well. But when I think of the infrastructure bill as well, I also think about some of the aging bridges we have in Richmond. Richmond's a very, very old city. We've invested in some new neighborhoods around the city, or they're not new, but people are living there now. And so people are living in places they weren't living in decades before, and using infrastructure in a different way than they used to use it. And so how do we upgrade the infrastructure in some of these neighborhoods? And also, how do we, using an equity lens, upgrade the infrastructure in some of these long forgotten, neglected Black and brown neighborhoods as well, where a lot of the working middle class live within the city. Folks sometimes, I think, don't recognize that when we talk about vehicular fatalities, things of that nature, sometimes there's a lot of those who are living in these neighborhoods who are either being, unfortunately, injured by car accidents, or those who are, unfortunately, they lose their lives because of these accidents.
Great. So I think we are coming up to audience questions. Okay, great. So I'm going to ask another question then. Both of your cities, to go back to the environment, have set goals to become carbon neutral in the next 20 to 25 years. And the Inflation Reduction Act has incentives to enable low-income and disadvantaged communities to benefit from zero-emissions technologies and other, GHG reduction activities that we talked about. So how will these financial supports help you reach your goals in ways that would benefit the health and energy costs in these communities the most in need, but also kind of touching on what we talked about before, like how do you explain this in a way that people don't hear this and they say, are you going to increase my energy bills?
Because they want to know that, right? They want to know, is this going to make my electricity bill go up? I know this. I was raised by my grandmother. Everywhere we went, she told me to cut off the lights everywhere we went. And I said, Grandma, they're not charging us that much. And she'd be like, no, cut that off. So the house will be pitch black. That's just how we live.
Sounds like a Caribbean household too.
But that's how but right now, when we're thinking about cost on everything, right? From eggs to you name it, you have to tell them there's some sort of benefit for them in this, right? And I think that's where we need the federal government's help on sort of how do we explain that this is a benefit for you. You should weatherize your home, right? Because a lot of times we get, a lot of rejections when we say we're trying to help can we come into your home to do X, Y, and Z? You're not coming in my house? Whoa. So there's a lot of cultural barriers out there that I think that sometimes when you put these policies in place, these ideas, folks are like, oh yeah, they're obviously gonna use it, and then you realize, oh whoa, no one's gonna allow you to just come up in their home and just do X, Y, and Z. So I think that's where we need the federal government to meet our residents where they are.
I also think it matters who the messenger is. And I think just as a country and as an environmental movement, we just have a lot of work to do. We just have to be candid with it. And I think too frequently people feel judged or talked down to, or they feel like they're being asked to do things they can't afford. So we have to do better. I mean, I just don't know another way to say it, because people, to Mayor Stoney's point, they want to be healthy. They want to help the environment. If there are things that they could do that's going to, make it cleaner or better in the city and have their children be healthier, they will choose it. But I do think it matters who's delivering that message, and we have to work harder about recruiting more Black people to talk about the environment, and we have to do it. It matters.
And can I say as well that I think when you're married, we have to have a healthy understanding of nuance, and nuance matters. And I think right now we live in a world where people don't care about nuance anymore. It's like you're either this or either you're that. It's an either or. We need to be able to message the both and to our communities, because they know they live in a world of both ands or in a gray area of but we make everything so absolute. Once again, flexibility.
So my final question before we go to the audience, so as you think about implementing all of this great stuff over the next 2 years, what is your biggest ask of the federal government? What is the thing you need the most to help you achieve these goals?
Well, I think President Biden spoke about this last night, and that is we got to finish the job, right? There's always a lot of uncertainty coming out of Washington, down into the states, into the cities, because, some people hesitate to sign up for a program or participate in a program because they think in a matter of 2 years, because of a change in leadership in the House of Representatives, that this program may not be there any longer. And so I think we have to finish the job and give confidence to leaders at the local level and the state level that this program is going to be here to last. I think we look at the American Rescue Plan. We heard folks start talking about clawing back those dollars. You're like, wait a minute, I just went to neighborhoods in my city and sold the American Rescue Plan to them and asked them how they want to see this implemented in their city, and you're talking about clawing back dollars because you gave us till 2026 to encumber these expenses? Folks don't, they once again, they see inconsistency and us talking out one side of, the other side of our necks. They don't want to see that. So what we need is not just President Biden, we need those in the legislature as well to commit to finishing the job.
Not to sound like a broken record, but we need national leadership in this post-COVID return to work environment. And I'm not just talking about our city now, I'm talking about cities around America that are, we have to be concerned about our downtowns. And let's just put a point on what that means. That means a lot of the programs and services that we're so proud of in DC are in jeopardy because decreased revenues means decreased investments in those things that have made us a great city. The transformation of our schools, the investments in public safety, our ability to have the gold standard in homeless services. All are a result of what we've been able to do in a robust downtown. So I think that is vitally important and is a signal to the private sector for cities that don't have a lot of federal workers. They have a lot of people who work with federal workers. So it is impacting that discussion too. And it is also not a black and white issue. It is not an issue that says, let's go back to 2019, because obviously we're not. But I think the key questions about American productivity and vibrancy is going to be key. So I continue to think that's one of the biggest things. I think the federal government also has a role to play in the conversation on public safety. You've heard the president speak, and I think for a lot of mayors, in talking about what we need to do to support good policing in our communities. But there's the other side of the equation that's not enforcement. It's also about opportunity. How are we making sure that we're creating great opportunities that disrupt cycles of violence in communities? So that includes how people who need a second chance are able to get employment. Or are there other tax or business incentives that we can work with the private sector on to do exactly that? And then the last thing I'll mention is housing. You heard Mayor Stoney already talk about housing as being key, but when I think about areas like we're in the Mid-Atlantic and the mayor is in the Commonwealth, but our cities, to stay competitive, we have to be housing competitive with other regions, or we're going to see, the great migration from the south to the north. We're starting to see it go the other way, where people may find more affordable housing. Now, they can't compete with our great city, our arts and culture, our proximity on the East Coast, our sports capital and all that.
Sounds like Richmond.
Yes, but this housing, and there is a role for the federal government, especially in the public housing space.
Great. Really?
We have a question from our online audience. Are you considering green banks to help get clean energy options direct to customers and others? And what do you need from the investment community to help advance your goals for your communities?
Well, I created a green bank probably about 5 years ago. So we have some but limited experience with the green bank, and I think we're primarily working with commercial interests. So I would want to look in to see how we can work directly with individuals.
We are just in the beginning stages of our attempt to be to go zero emissions come 2050. So we're not there yet, but I would love to see some information on it.
We have another question. How are you selling the opportunities and investments in your respective cities to both potential residents and to keep your long-term residents?
I'm thinking about that all the time. So how am I selling key investments? Well, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we set a goal of new residents in our downtown, 15,000 people. We have to create a better balance between workers and residents, and we're focused on that. And we want to grow our overall population by 25,000 people. So how do we do that? We keep the residents that we have, as I mentioned, and part of our big focus, as I also mentioned, is on that middle-income family who we may have lost during COVID, but who we are looking to get back. I just left a meeting with seniors in DC to talk about our budget, and one of the best compliments that one of them paid was, you know, I stayed in DC when a lot of my friends were moving out to the suburbs in the 70s and 80s, and they have no amenities like we have in DC for seniors. And now they're all trying to come back. And so we continue to sell our city for what we are. You know, we're for young people. They come here to change the world. They get jobs, they focus on policy, and they're excited to be working to make the world better. So that's who they are. But we also know that we are great for tech. We're best in the country for women in tech, and we pour into that as well. So what we offer is a great place to live, good paying jobs, great schools, and we're going to grow with the things that make us unique and good.
And I'll just add that Richmond is growing. You know, over the last, I've been mayor for the last 6 years. This is my 7th year in office. Over the course of the last decade, we have seen a 45% increase in residents who live in our downtown. The city is growing, the region is growing. We're seeing more and more people move out of the Northern Virginia area. Some of you all live in Northern Virginia. They're going to places like DC, or they're going to Richmond as well. And so I'm going to make the pitch here is that as we grow, we have to be very intentional about our growth, and we have to do it with an equity lens. That means growing, if we're going to grow and more people are going to move in, how do we ensure that our native residents they can survive and stay in the city for another generation? Because what comes with growth, unfortunately, is displacement. And so the ability to build more housing, create a bigger supply, a larger supply, will allow for us to keep costs down, but also we have to add some intentional policies there so we can keep Miss Jackie in our home who's lived there for 30 years.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. Just a personal note, I just moved and I stayed in DC, so you're welcome, Mayor.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Please stick around for our next conversation.